So this pandemic's making us think harder about a lot of things that we used to just take for granted. Our health, our family and friends, physical touch, travel. But the one thing the government's told Canadians not to worry about is food. When we all ran to the grocery stores and emptied them out at the start of the lockdowns, politicians told us to calm down, that our food supply chains were strong and robust.
Don't hoard. Supply chain is not the problem right now. Over-demand is the problem.
Think of your community. Buy only what you need at the store.
But over the last few weeks, it's become clear that our food supply chains aren't invincible. We've seen major COVID-19 outbreaks at meat processing facilities, fruit and vegetable farms struggling with labor shortages, but also an oversupply problem that's hitting farmers really hard. And all of this, on top of still seeing empty shelves for certain items, is making people nervous about the health of our food supply system. Global News' David Akin's been talking to people involved in supply chains across the country, and he's on the show today. We're going to talk about how COVID-19's hit the meat, seafood, and fruit and vegetable industries in Canada, and if we should actually be concerned about food security. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. Hi, David. Thanks so much for taking the time this morning.
No, it's great to be here.
So a lot of people are concerned about our food supply because we've been hearing about disruptions to the food supply chain, especially at meat packing plants. So I want to talk about meat first. There have been closures at a number of meat processing plants in Canada because of COVID-19 outbreaks. Can you tell me a bit about what's been happening at these plants?
Sure. In every single situation, and this is with pork processing plants as well as beef plants, the problem has been workers got sick. It's as basic as that. And at some point, and I'll use the Cargill plant in High River, Alberta as the greatest example. It's the most high profile example. Tons of workers got sick. As many from 1/3 to a half, depending on you counted, of workers at this plant.
Now, it was 2 weeks ago that Cargill has paused operations after hundreds of people associated with the plant tested positive for COVID-19. Cargill has since sanitized the plant and added protective barriers in washrooms and on the production floor.
And this plant in High River, it accounts for 36% of all of Canada's packaged beef. There's another Cargill plant in Guelph, Ontario. That accounts for 100% of the halal beef that is processed in Canada. They haven't had to shut down yet, but they've had sick workers. And then there's another plant in Brooks, Alberta, a JBS plant. They've had sick people, and they've had to reduce their processing capacity. And between those three plants, the Cargill in High River, JBS in Brooks, and Cargill in Guelph, those three plants, that's 85% of Canada's beef goes through those three plants, and they're all on reduced capacity for the simple reason that workers are sick and they cannot man the plants. On the pork processing side, same thing. The big pork processor in Canada is a company called Olymel. They're based out of Montreal, and they had to shut down a plant for a couple of weeks early on in this, I think up near Trois-Rivières. They've had other plants on sort of reduced capacity.
Canada's biggest pork producer, Olymel, has also lost significant processing capacity.
So a relatively small number of these factories process a huge proportion of the meat in Canada and the U.S., and so if one of those goes down, it has a huge ripple effect across the entire industry.
All the plants are now open, but typically in the pork processing side of things, there's usually 3 shifts for every plant. 2 shifts are actually processing pork, so they're slaughtering animals and they're butchering animals and processing it. And then 1 shift, and this is in normal times, does a plant clean. So that's been, you go through the plant and just sort of clean it, and that takes an entire shift. Right now, these plants are now down to 2 shifts. 1 shift is processing the animals, 1 shift is the cleaning. And here's one other wrinkle, and this is a federal government issue, is before this pandemic started, the Canada Food Inspection Agency, the CFIA, which sends meat inspectors into all of these plants to make sure that the meat is is properly processed to federal guidelines. Well, the CFIA was trying to get its overtime bill for meat inspectors under control. And so it had instructed meat inspectors, you can't do overtime. This is before the pandemic. Problem is, now we're into a pandemic and we have demand for beef. We need these meat inspectors, and some processors, particularly on the pork side, simply couldn't run at capacity because they had no meat inspectors that they were required by law to have in the plant when they're doing this. So that is now something that the federal government's dealing with. Now the meat inspector unions is saying, wait a minute, we don't want to be forced to go work in these unsafe plants because they're thick with COVID-19. So you can see it's a bit of a mess right now, complicated mess on the pork and beef processing.
And what makes these meat processing facilities prone to COVID-19 outbreaks? Talk a bit about the working conditions and who's working inside these facilities.
Sure, and I'll use some testimony given to a House of Commons committee just last week by a group called Food and Beverage Canada. That's the industry association that represents the country's food processors. This is for everybody from cheese to milk to beef and pork. And the woman who runs the Food and Beverage Canada said, all these plants, first of all, have been designed for food safety. And I think that's important to note, that there's never been an issue with the safety of the food that's been coming out of these plants, because the plants are designed for food safety. The plants are not designed, this woman told politicians, essentially for worker safety in the sense of keeping workers far apart. And so the challenge for the processors is now to redesign these lines where people are going to be very close together. So that's one thing.
In just 4 days, an online petition calling for a temporary shutdown of JBS Foods in Brooks has garnered thousands of signatures. The petition reads, production at the plant is not conducive to physical distancing, and masks and PPE provided are inadequate to protect against the spread. Now,
who is working at these plants? Again, it depends where you are. In rural Newfoundland and Labrador, it's the only job in town, and it pays okay. It certainly pays a living wage. In other parts of Canada, and I'll come back to the Cargill plant, it's a lot of immigrants. First-generation Canadians are taking these jobs, and most of these plants are unionized.
The United Food and Commercial Workers Union, representing roughly 2,500 employees at the JBS plant, says the petition is echoing what it's hearing from members and believes the plant should be closed temporarily.
Workers in these plants are simply not inputs in the production line. They are human beings. They are people's family members. And what we should be doing is putting their welfare and their health and safety before all else.
So there's issues. Unions have had to do a job in terms of communicating to people whose first language may not be English or French and tell them about safety issues. That's often been a challenge. I shouldn't say just the unions, both the unions and the employers, trying to communicate sometimes complicated information about safety to people whose facility with English or French is a bit difficult. So that's sort of the way the plants are set up. It's different for each type of animal, each type of food, but generally speaking, workers are working close together, and depending on the employer, they do or they don't have personal protective gear.
Okay, and I want to explain what happens when one of these meat plants has to be shut down because there's an outbreak and sort of the bottleneck that it creates. I know you talked to a farmer in southern Alberta, and tell me a bit about what he's been dealing with.
Yeah, I've been talking to lots of farmers, both beef ranchers and hog processors, because it's pretty much the same issue, is that, these animals keep growing and they're supposed to be, quote, sent to market at a certain point in their growth. And so the farmer moves the cattle or the hogs to the processor, and the processor slaughters the animal and moves it on to a grocery store shelf. Well, if the processor is shut down or if the processor cannot operate at capacity, those animals are still on the farm. They're still growing. They still need to be fed.
We have had reports of particularly market hogs not going to market as planned. We actually have a producer this week who had to hold back part of or all of his shipment.
And at one point last week, and it may still be, I'm sure it's still the case this week, we had something around the range of 100,000 head of cattle ready for market that were on farms and were costing hundreds of thousands of dollars a day to feed. So that's an additional cost now to the original producer, the beef, the cattle rancher, or the hog processor. Those farmers were taking any number of steps they could. I know hog processors, if you couldn't send your hogs to the normal plant you were sending in Montreal, you were trying to send down to the United States, to processors in the United States. The problem is, it's been even worse in the United States in terms of meat packing plants being shut down or idle because of COVID-19.
The head of Tyson Foods warning in a full-page newspaper ad, the food supply chain is breaking as meat processing plants across the country are being hit by coronavirus outbreaks and forced to shut down. Tyson Foods saying millions of pounds of meat will disappear from store shelves until its processing plants can reopen.
It's it's a crisis there as much as it is here. So there's, in all of North America, there isn't the capacity, and farmers now have animals on the farm. They have too many. Now, when we had the BSE crisis, the mad cow crisis in the early 2000s, the federal government instituted what was called a set-aside program for beef farmers. And it's really just as it sounds. You would take some cattle ready for market and set them aside, give them some other pasture, and the federal government would pay the beef farmer essentially to hold that extra inventory, if you will, until that crisis resolved itself. Cattle ranchers have been asking for the same thing so far from the feds. So far, they haven't got that. It's a little more different with hogs. You can't necessarily set aside hogs, or it's more difficult to do that. Same thing with poultry. You can't really set that aside. And so some producers in some parts of the country are forced to euthanize the animals on the farm. No farmer wants to do that. For one thing, it just means you're basically throwing away money. These animals cost hundreds of dollars to raise, and every time you kill an animal without sending it to market, boom, there goes a few $100. So there are reports that's in different regions of the country, animals have been forced to euthanize, and that brings up issues around, are they being euthanized in a humane manner? And we've heard some politicians have been asking about this. They've heard reports that in some cases, some farmers are not euthanizing animals in a humane manner. And so we get into all sorts of other issues that farmers aren't supposed to be dealing with. And I should say, where they can, they're butchering them on the farms and maybe sending the meat to local food banks. But you can't do that when you really literally have thousands of animals that you just can't put up at your farm.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And are we seeing any impact on consumers yet in terms of price or a shortage?
Again, it all depends on where your meat is coming from. It's just really going to depend on where you are and what supply chain your grocer has to be able to procure some of this beef. And at the end of the day, when you go to the grocery store, you may see different cuts of meat are available or not available. And some cuts of meat will be priced higher than others. I mean, to switch things a little bit more, I think one of the bigger issues is we may see some of these shortages down the road. So in other words, some meat suppliers to grocers may have enough for the next month, but it's these problems with processors may manifest themselves in a few weeks' time. On the fruits and vegetable side, we really haven't talked about that. Our fruit and vegetable farmers in Canada need 25,000 temporary foreign workers every spring and every fall to plant and to harvest fruits and vegetables.
We need them. That's all there is to it. We can't not get Canadians to do the work on a continuous basis. Everybody says you're getting unskilled labor, but they're not unskilled labor because they've been coming here and doing the same jobs for years, okay, and coming back to the same farms. And they know how to pick an apple and how to treat it gently. They know how to pick a berry without squeezing it. They know how to pick a tomato without sticking their fingernails in it.
And this is not just Canada. Same thing in the United States. We buy a lot of produce from California. And who plants that broccoli in California, that lettuce in California? Largely workers from Mexico and Guatemala. Those are the two big countries that Canada gets workers from. And because of the pandemic, some of those workers simply don't want to leave their countries. And those that do have to go through special protocols in Canada in order to get here. They got to be quarantined for 14 days. The United States doesn't want any temporary foreign workers, so it's very hard to get them in to plant the produce we'll need. And if stuff is not planted now, we're going to see shortages of fresh fruit and vegetables in a few months' time, in the fall.
And like I say, if one or two farms gets the virus and they get shut down, it's going to be tough. So we've noticed a big increase in sales in herb plants, in vegetable plants, tomatoes, peppers, lettuce. Everybody wants to plant a garden. Everybody's preparing for the worst.
And that is an issue that folks are warning about now, that you can still get stuff that's been growing all winter essentially in California or Mexico or warmer climates. That's what Canadians eat now. But we would want to be eating Canadian produce in a few months, and not all that produce got planted this spring. And that's an issue around temporary foreign workers, labor shortages.
We'll be right back. I know you've also talked to some fishermen. How has this hit the seafood business in Canada?
So on our seafood business, and that's a very important business for Canada, there's a few issues. First, there is the people who are called the harvesters. These are the fishermen, the fisherwomen who go out on boats to get lobster, to get crab, to get fish. Those folks, it's almost impossible for any social distancing. We talked to a crab fisherman, and he showed us his boat. And, there's 8 people who sleep on bunk beds below decks. They're cramped like sardines.
It's not even practical even to have these rules for us. They don't work. It's just impossible to do the distance on a boat.
And so everybody in a outport in Newfoundland and Labrador has got to trust that the crews going on these boats are not doing anything stupid. They're self-isolating before they go out. They're trying to self-isolate when they leave. It's very difficult. We're fortunate that we haven't seen the spread of COVID-19 in our Atlantic provinces right now. They've been, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador, relatively fewer cases. A little different on our BC coast. I've heard reports from advocates there and from industry associations that they are concerned about some outbreaks, particularly in northern BC, salmon farms, for example, sea urchins. That's an issue. Then there's the processor, the seafood processors, and seafood processors have early on, so far as I can tell, taken steps to acquire personal protective equipment for their fish plant workers, crab plant workers. The good news for the seafood processors, they still by and large good demand. If they can process it, they're going to be able to sell it.
But a lot of these products like crab and lobster are eaten at restaurants. So how has this sector and other food suppliers, how are they dealing with the drop in demand from restaurants that have been shut down?
Restaurant demand has completely evaporated. Crab fishermen, lobster fishermen, high-end products like that, they're scrambling to find other places to put their product. What do you do? I mean, seriously, we heard last week that we're about to end up with 40 million pounds of lobster with, quote, no home. There is a huge business in Canada for French fries, and they're almost all served in restaurants. And so hundreds, maybe thousands of potato farmers grow potatoes just for the French fry restaurant business. I talked to a farmer in southern Manitoba. He's got 19 million pounds of potatoes in storage that he can't sell. They were to go to a processor.
Our growers will be done planting by the end of this week. They've got about a 25% cutback on their 2020 acres. So that is going to help somewhat, but there's still going to be about 100,000 ton in Alberta that have no home.
And apparently, this is the experts say, for every 10% drop in restaurant sales, grocery store sales only pick up about 3%. And when you think about that, think of a buffet at a restaurant. There's a lot of waste. We don't eat the entire buffet, but at home, if you don't eat everything at dinner tonight, well, that's leftovers for your lunch tomorrow. So we're a little more efficient in the way we use food at home than we are food when we go out. So our farmers are built to sell to the restaurant trade, and it's a very different way selling to the restaurant trade. You're selling, 100-kilogram bags of flour, for example, that is just, there's no way even, that's like Costco size times 20, that there's no way a consumer is going to be able to buy the 100-kilogram flour bag. And so the whole system is not built to immediately switch from a restaurant trade to a consumer trade. People are trying to do it quickly, but those producers, be it potato farmers, be it a crab fisherman that sell to the restaurant biz, it's been very difficult for them to find replacements, customers, or change the way they package and distribute their produce or their product into a consumer chain rather than a restaurant chain.
Yeah, and this is why people may notice that we're seeing higher valued cuts of beef and things like that at grocery stores that we would traditionally be eating at a restaurant.
Yeah, when you're going to see crab legs at a probably pretty good price pretty soon. If the crab season 2 is open on the East Coast, and those crab legs would normally go to, again, high-end sort of situations, cruise ships, casinos, hotels, and they're now going to end up in grocery stores and probably at a pretty good price.
So David, just to wrap up our conversation, it seems like farmers could suffer huge losses here as a result of all these things like the drop in demand from restaurants and the closures of meatpacking plants. What do you think could be the long-term impacts of all of this on Canada's agricultural industry?
Well, I'll go back to the BSE crisis, and in the BSE crisis, 27,000 cattle farmers packed it in, just said, I'm not doing this anymore. So we may lose some producers in some regions. That happened in the BSE. And how about this as well? I know sometimes cattle farming gets a bad rap from a greenhouse gas viewpoint, that the cows put out a lot of methane, but also in the way we raise cows in Canada, it is on essentially grassland pasture, undeveloped pasture. We lost 5 million acres of essentially grassland, natural grassland after BSE. So we may see land use patterns change dramatically as well if producers shift to something else. If they don't do this or that. So the cost really right now to producers, to farmers, is essentially this warped system, having to change to new products, having to change to new distribution systems. And the question for a lot of farmers is, how permanent will those changes be? All the experts I've spoken to say we shouldn't be worried too much about food security. People on lower incomes should be worried about food security, as they often always are. If you don't have income to buy healthy food, well, we know there's a lot of Canadians right now at work that may not have money to buy the food. But we still should be able to produce enough food. Every expert says, in the big picture, we shouldn't worry too much about food security. The issue is certain kinds of products, certain kinds of availability. That is going to be what our challenge is over the next several months.
Yeah, good to know. Okay, David, thank you so much.
Okay, no problem, guys. Cheers.
All right, that's the show. But before we go, a lot of you might be wondering what's going on with the flour supply and why we're mostly seeing giant bags of flour in stores. I asked David about this, and he said the issue isn't that there isn't enough flour, but there aren't enough smaller bags right now. So that's another thing that processors are trying to figure out. And that's all for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.